and that when the investigative judgment finished, he would come. And Uriah Smith said it began in 1844 and will be brief, but it's now been going for about 170 years or so.
Yeah.
But that was the doctrine, and it robbed Adventists of Christian assurance. New Testament says, "These things I write unto you, that you may know you have eternal life."
Did he threaten to sue the church because they'd cut his sustentation or something at the time? I can't remember what I've read on that.
I cannot tell you a certain answer there, but Ray was no coward. And originally, the first meetings he had with church leaders, they seemed to nod their heads and say, "You're right," but then they went backwards. And I don't doubt that Ray took that rather with umbrage.
And by taking away your credentials and his credentials, they send a signal to people, I guess, to be careful.
In Australia, Pastor Parmenter lined up all the heads of the church and insisted on unity, but several men would not vote for it. And the lawyer, the Australian lawyer, said, "What you're doing is illegal and Ford could sue you."
When I read, and I might have to read it again to get the numbers correct, but my memory was that it was a Ponzi scheme, the Davenport thing, and something like $70 million.
It was huge.
And what shocked me, though, and again, I need to just double check this, but my understanding is that $20 million of church money was actually used. So not just people falling, not just administrators falling for a Ponzi scheme, but actual church money.
Peter, I understand that to be the case. It was a great tragedy and nothing was ever done to correct it.
I think in the Time magazine article, a spokesperson for Neil Wilson said that accountability would occur,
but it didn't
never
happen, except men were sent higher into the health food work, where they made much higher wages than when they were crooks with money as presidents of conferences.
So leaving the Ankerberg show, and I encourage people, if they're interested, to go and look it up. It's a fascinating YouTube clip. It goes for at least an hour, and it's just full of interesting information. In 1984, Ankerberg interviewed Walter Martin and William Johnson, who I think was editor at the time of the Adventist Review.
Yes.
And that's a fascinating watch as well. Walter Martin, for those that don't know, I think he and Barnhouse, I can't remember Barnhouse's first name, but
Donald.
They were about to put out a book that was going to be on
I knew
cults.
Walter Martin very well.
Right.
He and I spent hours together. We talked from the same platform.
Wow. And he was going to write a book about cults and include Adventism. How did he get in touch with the church? And then
do you want to get into questions on doctrine?
Yes, I want to head into that.
All right. It began with T.E. Unrah, U-N-R-A-H, sending Steps to Christ to Donald Barnhouse, who was editor of Eternity. Barnhouse, who hated Adventists by reputation, sent back a scathing reply, which was very strange because very few people in the world have ever been upset by Steps to Christ. It's a beautiful book. It's been translated into over 130 languages. But Unrah was so disturbed, he kept in contact with Barnhouse, and ultimately Barnhouse called in Walter Martin.
Sorry to interrupt, but what was Unrah's role in the church?
He was president of the Pennsylvania Conference.
Right.
And Donald Barnhouse, was editor of Eternity. Very fine Christian. But he asked Walter Martin to write a book about Adventists. Martin said, yes, but I must interview their leaders first. So he first began with L.E. Froome and W.E. Reed, and later was enlarged to include R.A. Anderson. That's why Question on Doctrine has often been called Frieda,
yes.
Froome, Reed, Anderson.
Yep.
Walter Martin went with George Cannon to interview these men, and he was surprised when he found that Froome and Reed and Anderson did not believe what he thought. Martin believed that Adventists denied the atonement on the cross, taught that grace alone was not sufficient for salvation, that Christ was a created being and had a sinful nature, and the men he interviewed denied all of these. But sadly, Martin and Barnhouse got the impression that only a lunatic fringe of Adventists believed those four things.
Do you think this was intentional, that Frieda, and I'm using air quotes, was wanting that to be the case?
Well,
was there an intention to mislead?
The fact that Froome and Reed and Anderson was so emphatic and clear on the evangelical position, I think Martin and Barnhouse took it for granted that they were representative, but they really weren't. Andreasen had been among the top theologians. He denied the Trinity. He said Christ was a created being. He said Christ had a sinful nature. And he said there had to be a generation of perfect Christians to bring Christ back. Andreasen was no theologian. I think he was a good Christian, but he wrote a series of letters called Letters to the Churches round about 60 and 61. So the church revoked his ordination.
Really? And
in a few months he died. Then the church revoked the revocation. But Andreasen...
Why wasn't he invited to be on? Because at the time, I understand he was very influential.
He was old.
Okay.
And also I think they knew that he was heretical.
Was he heretical, or was that really the mainstream Adventist view? The 3 points you mentioned there, were they really
it was held
the mainstream?
By many Adventists, inherited from the past. Waggoner began some of it, but also taught by Andreasen. Andreasen was field secretary for years. He taught the Adventist Theological Seminary for about 10 years. He was president of conferences. He was president of colleges. He was tremendously influential, and yet theologically he was far from the Bible as Dan from Beersheba. And when he wasn't invited to give an opinion on questions on doctrine, he was very upset. Then Froome wrote an article. This is now 57, the year QD was printed, 1957. Froome wrote an article in the ministry on the complete atonement at the cross, and Andreasen exploded, and he protested, and then he wrote all these letters condemning the church leaders. But he was really saying what thousands of Adventists believed, but that the men who knew a bit of theology at the top did not believe.
That's interesting, because what I wanted to say is that in my humble armchair, Mr. Nobody philosopher, my view on it is that 1957 and QOD, Questions on Doctrine, is ground zero for everything that led to the problems that you had at Glacier View.
It began an explosion among Adventists, not just Andreasen, but thousands of Adventists.
So the grassroots agreed with Andreasen.
Yes, and it continued for decades. So men like Herbert Douglas and top men running the Review. Kenneth Wood, that's the name I was trying to think of. Kenneth Wood. They agreed with Andreasen, and Douglas did. And so the thing has never been settled, although they had a QD conference a year or two ago trying to bring unity. Julius Nam, I think he wrote his dissertation for a doctorate in connection with questions on doctrine, but he headed up this conference a few years ago, and there was an expression of both opinions there, and it's never really been settled.
If you read Great Controversy, though, wouldn't you think that Andreasen and and the grassroots that followed his thoughts had a leg to stand on, though?
If you read the early testimonies, Great Controversy has a fair bit of the gospel in it because it uses Luther and Calvin and Zwingli, but it's the first 40 years of the church, and the early testimonies of Ellen White, you could read them as teaching Christ was a created being. She was not altogether clear on the deity of Christ till the 1890s, and Desire of Ages is her first book that clearly teaches the Trinity and the...
Because before that she didn't believe in the Trinity?
Sounded very similar to the rest of the flock, and most of the Adventists had come from a variety of churches, many of them not believing in the Trinity or the deity of Christ. So you have a church for 40 years astray theologically and very legalistic.
In the early 80s, my generation was too young to really understand what was going on. We could just see this conflict between what we termed conservatives and liberals, and around that time, not a very nice term arose. The concerned brethren grew up, and we would call them the CBs in a derogatory way. And I feel bad about that because it was really just me being ignorant and a bunch of my generation just not realising. I think we thought that the conservatives were just people that were getting older and that their issues were with hair length and fashion and music, whereas really their issue was with, hey, in 1957 you guys wrote a book and you took our church away from us.
Correct.
So I can see why they were concerned. I can see their passion
then Ford
and
comes
anger.
Along,
yeah,
and he's not teaching.
That's right.
The pioneer Adventism.
Yeah.
He's teaching the everlasting gospel, which they didn't understand. Adventists taught that righteousness by faith was justification plus sanctification. But the Greek word for righteousness is the same word as for justification. Whenever you read about righteousness by faith, New Testament means justification only. Once you accept Christ, you have eternal life. You bring forth fruits of holiness in a progressive sanctification that never comes to an end. When Christ comes, we're still imperfect. So there were many good men, many old ministers that were lovely Christians, but they didn't know any theology, and they clung to teachings from Wagner and Andreasen and thought they were being loyal to God.
Did they cling, though, to the general thrust and tone of the Adventist church, though?
Well,
you came along with quite a radical...
you must remember, until I began teaching at Avondale, most Adventists taught Christ had a sinful nature.
Yeah, that's right. And that's how they then can extrapolate.
Although the Adventist commentary, in its additional notes from Ellen White on John chapter 1, has very clear statements. Do not set him before the people as a man with the propensities of sin. He was that holy thing. But who reads? Nobody reads.
And I guess with that view of the nature of sin, of Christ's nature, human nature, they then extrapolated that if he could do it, we can too.
The last generation must keep it perfectly. It was Wagner that came up with that after 1888.
So in 1957 with Questions on Doctrine, that tried to change the view of the nature
Correct,
of Christ,
but it didn't succeed.
What did it say? What was the Question on Doctrine? What did Frieda say was the nature of Christ?
It stressed his sinless nature. It stressed a perfect atonement made at Calvary. It stressed the Trinity. It stressed that Christ was from everlasting. It stressed that grace, not works, gave us a share in what Calvary did. So Questions on Doctrine, theologically, except for the sanctuary pages, on the matter about Christ and the atonement and salvation, it is theologically accurate, but it's not accurate when it deals with 1844.
Right. and with the nature of Christ, that was the cat amongst the pigeons. That was the exploding bomb that formed the concerned brethren.
As an example by men like Wagner and Andreasen. But the New Testament makes Christ first our substitute, only secondly an example in meekness and kindness and goodness. But for salvation, he's our representative and our substitute.
So when you came along with your
stress on the
gospel, that's why they were threatened so greatly.
Yes,
their fundamental identity was being attacked.
I had the support of Naden and Frame for most of the 70s, and I knew those men very well. My last Bible study before I became an Adventist was given me by L.C. Naden when he was heading up the Adventist Radio Church. In his Daking House, Sydney office, he gave me my last Bible study. We were very good friends, so he supported me, and Frame supported me. We corresponded to and fro for years when he was dealing with the Standish brothers. The Standish brothers represented Wagner, represented sinful nature of Christ, represented legalism. I think they were earnest Christians, but their theology was terrible. Frame, who was not a theologian, was a pretty good judge of people, and he felt the Standish brothers were not being wise as well as not being theological.